If you love our modern society, you can thank this guy. If you hate our modern society, you can also blame this guy. But the one thing that you cannot possibly do is ignore this guy. This guy would be John Stuart Mill. This month we are reading his most famous work, On Liberty. I'm Michael Knowles. This is the Book Club. And I'm joined by Joe Fournieri, a professor of political science at RIT, the author of a number of books on Abraham Lincoln's political faith, Abraham Lincoln, philosopher-statesman. He's working on a new book about Frederick Douglass. You're also the director of the Center for, I'm going to see if I get this right, Statesmanship, Law, and
Liberty.
Liberty. How could I
like
forget
the
Liberty?
title
It's the title of the book.
You're correct. It was
Joe,
inspired by Mill.
Thank you for coming on the show.
Yeah, I'm delighted to be here.
I always task the guest with summing up the book. For those who perhaps did not read the whole thing on time, summing it up in 60 seconds.
The purpose of the book is to find a principle that will limit the authority of the state and society over individuals. Mill's particularly troubled about tyranny of the majority, so not only the danger of state interference with one's personal liberty, but also the prevailing opinion and the danger of conformity and self-censorship. Censorship, the evil is twofold. If the opinion is true, you're depriving this generation and future generations of the truth, which is necessary to advance societal progress. But even if it's wrong, you deprive society and the individual of a clearer perception and livelier impression of the truth. And part of Mill's defense of human individualism and dignity is you have the freedom to make mistakes.
Yeah.
And the costs of restricting that far outweigh any benefits of the paternalism. And that's part of growth.
This man, maybe the best educated man ever, or maybe not ever, but certainly in the last 300 years, educated by his utilitarian father, his utilitarian pseudo-uncle, Jeremy Bentham. Godfather. He studies everything, and he synthesizes all of it in a modern liberal philosophy of liberty, where he says, to have progress, to ensure human development and flourishing, we've got to protect free speech, we've got to protect free actions, we need to protect the people to have free government, we got to protect, most importantly, the individual from the people, because once they get that free government, they might try to impose a tyranny of the majority on that individual. And sure, there might be some downsides to all of this, and we'll address them in the later chapters.
Both state and society are a threat to liberty. Mill seeks a principle. He says one very simple principle that will place a limit on the authority of both, this is important, state and society. The threat is not only from civil magistrates, it is from
the cancel
society.
mob.
It's from the prevailing opinion. Mill's very troubled by the tendency of conformity and mediocrity in his own era, and I think he'd be troubled by concerns of that today as well. So this principle that he devises is famously known as the harm principle. Or the harm to others principle, that the only justification for restricting the liberty of an individual is harm to another or harm to the larger society. Mill then, in his second chapter, considers the liberty of thought and discussion. He provides a broad overview of the history of censorship, which culminates with the cautionary tales, in his view, of the persecution of both Socrates, the wisest man in Greece, and Jesus. Mill has some very fine statements about freedom of speech that much of our jurisprudence today on the First Amendment is a footnote to Mill. And here he says that very often the truth emerges through the collision of different opinions, and that it really truth is a reconciliation of partial views. There's a very famous statement that should be emblazoned on the door of every administrator and every university throughout the country, that all silencing of opinion is an assumption of infallibility.
Right,
Very
right.
strong.
He focuses a lot on this notion that if you would censor anyone or any idea, then you're claiming to be infallible yourself. And he's not simply saying, well, a view is true or a view is false. As you point out, he says often, even heretics will have a little bit of the truth, and it's helpful to get that information out there. Often people who seem politically subversive, they've got a little bit of the truth, and so you want to be able to get that little bit of the truth. And you more broadly need to protect individuals, especially men of genius, to be able to cultivate their ideas and to express them and move society forward in progress. Because even if a genius is 1 in 1,000, even if a genius is 1 in 1,000,000, you still need fertile ground for that genius to be cultivated. That's at least Mill's view. I got this book first time when I graduated high school. My assistant principal, a wonderful woman, very liberal, she knew I was conservative. She said, Michael, I'm giving you this book on liberty by John Stuart Mill. And I thought, I like liberty. I'm a conservative. So I took it and I didn't read it. Like all good teenage boys, I put it on a shelf somewhere and I didn't read it for a long time. Then I finally open it up and I find out there's this guy. This is a guy who learned, I think, Greek by the age of 3. He learned Latin by the age of 5 or 6 or something. His father, James Mill, was one of the founders of utilitarianism with Jeremy Bentham, who also helped to educate Mill. And they said, this guy, John Stuart Mill, we are going to set him aside. We are going to educate him in the most intense way possible. He's going to be a super genius. He's going to be a leading thinker. And he did become a genius and a leading thinker. But he was educated by some of the wrong-headedest people in all of history. The founder of utilitarianism. And so he becomes a utilitarian. Utilitarian meaning you advocate for the greatest good for the most people. But he kind of modifies it.
Yeah, he modifies Bentham's utilitarianism, and he attempts to preserve a hierarchy of goods. The greatest happiness for the greatest number comes down to seeking pleasure and avoiding pain. But for Mill, but Mill recognizes that there are higher and lower pleasures.
The greatest pleasure for the greatest number, in Bentham's view, which I'm maybe oversimplifying a little, might be a bunch of candy bars for everyone. But in Mill's view, there are higher pleasures, there are higher contributors to happiness.
And he famously says it's better to be Socrates unsatisfied than a pig satisfied, or a fool satisfied.
J.S. Mill is one of the founders of classical liberalism. He's one of the most important thinkers of this period. But he's not quite the same as someone like John Locke. John Stuart Mill is not grounding his political philosophy on natural rights exactly, right? He's grounding it on consequentialism.
It's based on his utilitarianism.
Yeah.
Notwithstanding criticisms we may have of Mill, and we can discuss them later, that he provides one of the most profound and strongest defenses of individual liberty and freedom and dignity related to human flourishing. He's a real champion of individualism and the liberal values of pluralism, individualism, free speech, freedom of association. We find some of their strongest defenses in this little work, which I would consider, absolutely required reading for students.
He puts some limits on it too, though. For instance, he says, well, you're not going to afford all of these individual liberties to a child. A child is not capable of exercising them. He says, you're not going to afford all of these individual liberties to savages, people who have not been cultivated.
There's a condescending colonial element there to Mill. Of course, he worked for the East India Company. He says that so-called barbarian nations are not fit for liberty. They're not at that stage. That is his progressive stage of history. I think one of the most interesting limits that's very relevant for American jurisprudence, and you can find the strain of this limitation in Justice Holmes's clear and present danger standard all the way to Brandenburg versus Ohio, deals with the question of direct incitement. And that's his example of the corn dealers, right? He says no one would presumed to think that action is unlimited to the same extent speech is. But what are the boundaries of free speech? Where do you distinguish between punishable
When he says
and protected speech?
if you're just having a casual conversation about the perfidy of the corn dealers,
Yes.
just me and Joe
They're
sitting
starvers
there,
of the
those
poor.
jerks, then that's no big deal.
And private property is robbery.
Yes.
Right.
But what if we had that same conversation in front of an angry mob, on
at a corn dealer's home?
At the corn dealer's home.
Correct.
With pitchforks and torches.
Right.
That would not be protected.
And that's important because the example shows that what's being restricted is not the content of the speech, but it is the circumstances in which the speech is uttered. And in order to restrict freedom or liberty of the individual expression in this case, which Mill says is almost absolutely protected, that there has to be a close causal connection, a nexus between the speech and some imminent grave danger, right? An instigation to mischief, he says.
This brings us to another point that Mill makes beautifully, or at least better than other liberal writers make it, which is, he says, okay, what about private sins? The lesser liberal writers, they will say, private sins are nobody's business. What someone does in his own bedroom or closet or what, that has nothing to do with you. You just focus on the sins that take place in public. And that's what we can legislate about. But Mill says, well, no, of course, private vice, private behavior is going to have some effect on the public because we're people. In as much as the vice affects us, it's going to affect our public obligations. If I'm a drunk, then I'm not going to take care of my kids in the way I should. I'm not going to perform my job in the way I should. I'm not going to be a contributing member to society in the way that I should. And so that private vice, when I get hammered, at night, is actually going to have a political consequence.
Mill would warn us here, and he makes a very crucial distinction when he speaks about the harm principle between what we may say is self-regarding or self-concerning acts and other regarding acts. The coercive force of the state should only regulate or restrict or interfere with other regarding acts. Now, Mill himself recognized this is not always an easy line to draw. Yeah. In the later chapters of the book, he uses the example of drunkenness. Yeah. And he's appalled at prohibition. He thinks that goes too far in interfering with individual liberty. You can reason, you could persuade, you could remonstrate with someone who engages in private vice, but it's proverbially a cure worse than disease to empower the state to micromanage their lives. If the drunk is habitually violent, then in this case, his drinking may be restricted.
Right, but only not on the drinking itself, but on the violence.
The other regarding
on
act.
all of the other. So it's not that you're legislating private morality in Mill's scheme.
No.
It's that you are prosecuting the consequences of that private
Correct.
morality.
The state is to remain neutral in regard to private morality so long as it does not interfere with the liberty of others or does not do some harm to the collective well-being of the state. Let's say, planning a conspiracy to overthrow the government.
What a great point that he then elaborates on in all sorts of different ways, which is, okay, if I've got total freedom to do whatever I want with my person, to myself, in the privacy of my own home, do I have the right to sell myself into slavery? Do I have the right to kill myself? All sorts of things that modern liberals tell us we do have the right to do.
Well, he said he forthrightly denies that you have the right to sell yourself into slavery.
Yeah.
The preservation here of human dignity requires that people be permitted to make mistakes, right? And Mill famously says that individualism is defined as pursuing one's good in one's own way. And that may trouble traditionalists, but the alternative is empowering an authority to go too far to restrict individual freedom. In Mill's term, and that human beings cannot develop fully.
Yeah.
Right. He says that they should pursue their own path of life based on their individual passions and abilities and impulses. So he recognizes, I think, diversity in its best sense.
Yes.
And of course, he defends diversity of ideas, really the marketplace of ideas is we can attribute in many ways to Mill, because
Right.
truth emerges through the collision of different opinions, and through that engagement with opposing views, we deepen our own understanding as a living truth rather than a dead dogma.
It strikes me in all the debates over free speech, I've been canceled from all sorts of college campuses, and you see it on campus
Of course.
much more than I do.
Yes.
But one of the arguments from the people who want to cancel all of us is, well, we can't tolerate intolerance. And so, if I'm giving a speech on how a man can't be a woman or something, heaven forfend, that would be intolerant according to them. And so you can't be asked to tolerate intolerance. That would undermine tolerance. And Mill makes the same argument about liberty. He says the reason that you can't be justified in selling yourself into slavery on the grounds of liberty is that would totally undermine liberty. And so it would be incoherent. It would be incoherent to kill yourself.
One of the strengths of Mill's philosophy here is that he tries to articulate a core minimal consensus, right, for liberal democracies that we all have to agree with, notwithstanding. Pluralism is crucial, but to enjoy pluralism that doesn't descend into anarchy, there has to be some minimal consensus.
Yeah.
And so he seeks to protect and draw attention to these different experiments in life with individuals pursuing their own good in their own way. And that means that there should be free to make their own mistakes, and that they should not be censored unless, again, that speech, if you will, crosses the line into some direct incitement. And again, Mill, I think, anticipates the court's jurisprudence. I think the court has done a fine job in protecting speech and drawing clear lines. The whole conservative liberal debate, I think really if we look at someone like Mill, we could sign on, whether we're conservative or liberal, to a lot of Mill's thought, I hope.
Certainly in the American
conservatives
context,
should be trying to conserve these core liberal principles. Yeah. I don't want to give up some of Mill's principles.
But then one of the criticisms that comes from outside of Mill, outside of the kind of left-wing liberal and right-wing liberal framework, is that sure, J.S. Mill, he's all well and good, and if I were writing and reading at the time that he wrote, maybe it would be fine. But that the lowest common denominator here that he's giving us for consensus in society, the harm principle, the individualism that comes as a result of this philosophy,
diversity of opinion,
that it ends up eroding the foundation of the society, such that Millian liberty might work well in the 19th century, but fast forward to 2024, we don't even know what a woman is anymore. Did Mill plant the seeds of our destruction? I'm not the one saying it. I'm saying that's the critique that comes from some of the conservatives.
I understand. I think that's unfair to Mill. There is a tension. I think that Mill perhaps does not give enough credence to authority, and that he can unleash a radical individualism that's subversive of even any minimal consensus, right? To what extent my individual freedom or repudiates the liberty principle. On what grounds, should I accept it at all? But I think that historically, even Mill has done well with us till I think probably the 20th century, when more radical postmodern interpretations I think are more responsible for that erosion than Mill himself. Mill was pretty consistent with some of the strains in the Enlightenment and its criticism of religion, but not all, right? The Enlightenment is much more complex.
And it's even, I think it was Mill said that his big gap in his education, this is probably the most educated man of the last 300 years, but he admitted he had a big gap, and the big gap was religion. Mm-hmm. He was raised without a religion. He was probably more familiar with the details of religion than most people living today, even who would call themselves religious, but he missed a few things. I felt he was a bit harsh on the mackerel-snapping papists, such as myself.
Yeah.
I felt he
most intolerant of religion.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yes.
At least Catholics have a devil's advocate.
Right. Yes. Yes. I feel Mill is not sufficiently adulatory towards some of the medieval scholastic philosophers. I think he downplays that a little bit. It does then lead to the big question of the ethical grounding of his philosophy, because Mill is a utilitarian with an asterisk. It's a little bit different than Bentham's, but he would call himself a utilitarian. And so even at the basis of what is ethics, that's one school. Consequentialism is one school. Immanuel Kant has another school, and he says people should read Kant even if he's wrong. Kant has another school, which is deontology. Instead of the ends justify the means, you look at the consequences of an action. Deontological school says you judge the action based on the action, based on a set of rules. And then there's still another school. That would be the school going back to Aristotle, the teleological virtue ethics on the virtue of character of the actors, in these ethical questions. To what degree does it matter that John Stuart Mill is grounding this philosophy that shaped our whole country on a kind of a dubious, at least in my view, ethical school?
One can agree with some of his conclusions and recognize there may be a sturdier basis to ground them. And still recognize these are sound arguments. Now, in regard to Mill's bristling hostility toward religion at times, I think Nietzsche had it right in Daybreak. He said that the secularism of Mill and the utilitarian movement, that it's still parasitical on Judeo-Christian faith, because it still presumes that that truth can be known.
Yes.
That there is some objective standpoint, that there's a human dignity. Right? That pluralism is good.
That we can trust our faculties of reason.
Right. Not that it's inevitable, but there is progress. Right? Therein lies a very interesting exploration. Right. To what extent is Mill still within a Judeo-Christian horizon, even though he seeks to find another grounding on utilitarianism for these core liberal values that he seeks to uphold?
Where do you rank Mill's influence even just on the United States? Because I'm reminded of Tocqueville's observation that Americans talk like liberals, but they kind of behave like Burkeans. They behave like conservatives. We talk one way, we don't always act the way that we talk. We hear a lot about the importance of John Locke or Montesquieu to the American founding, the American project. We hear less about John Stuart Mill. And then there's a question of today. Have we abandoned all these guys? So is the problem that we've got too much John Stuart Mill or not enough John Stuart Mill? Or does he not matter at all?
Mill still matters. And I think that, Mill is writing in the 19th century, so obviously he didn't have an influence on the founding.
Right.
But I would say that the court's jurisprudence on the First Amendment, which is really the cornerstone of our republic, free speech, free expression, freedom of association, that it is a footnote to Mill. We would do well, even using Mill's own advice, to examine Mill's opinions in defense of these core values. Because I don't know if anyone provided a better argument for free speech or free press. There's other arguments. I don't know if it is compelling. What's interesting is when he talks about on liberty, he doesn't mention his utilitarianism. I think maybe one or two places it's offhand, which again, raises the question of whether you can defend these values without utilitarianism.
There's something too that's helpful about Mill's utilitarianism here, which is that his arguments are all pretty persuasive because they're so pragmatic and practical. He's not assuming a social contract. He says in the essay, look, we all know society isn't started based on a social contract. We all know that it's not, and we wouldn't even want to rip it all up and have a new contract. He's not really a pie in the sky kind of a philosopher. He's saying, look, here's why I think freedom of speech is good. And here's why you might disagree with me. And here's why some other guy who's not you might even disagree with both of us. But here's why I think practically, if we all had to pick, we'd probably pick my version of it too. It's really almost conversational.
Look at the examples he gives of engaging contrary opinions. He gives the examples of the Socratic dialectic.
Yeah.
Right? He gives the example of the devil's advocate in the church. This is, I hope, a core value of our Western civilization, in the best sense, and of the university, to engage diverse ideas in a civil manner.
Now, what happened? I guess so. The right-wing critics will argue, well, this idea taken to its logical conclusion undermines the idea.
Moral chaos.
Right.
Yes.
But what's the other explanation? Is there another explanation of how our universities now are the most hostile places to free speech, and our country, barely recognizes the First Amendment, at least in the case of conservatives?
I don't want to paint with too broad a brush about institutions. I know that our president has robustly defended free speech at RIT. I'm very proud of that. And I think there's an ongoing struggle. But I think that the effort to suppress speech and to censor it is illiberal, right? It's a violation of Mill's values, of traditional classical liberalism. And that really it's the result of the theories of people like Marcuse.
People in the Marxist tradition.
Right. I think in that postmodern Marxist Frankfurt School, right? Repressive tolerance.
Yeah.
And that is what became regnant in many universities. And there's a collision between that way of thinking, that ideology, and this minimal liberal consensus, which I hope conservatives, liberals, moderates could all rally behind. So we're all, I hope, conservative liberals attempting to preserve some of these core values. I like individualism. I think individualism is good. I'm glad that I wasn't born into a station in life that I couldn't escape, and that I had the mobility based on my own self-knowledge and impulses and desires to pursue the kind of vocation that I wanted. I'm glad freedom of speech and expression is protected. That's what enabled the civil rights movement. That's what enabled abolitionism to make a difference. I think the task is to build a consensus, even though we may disagree about the ultimate grounding. And I still think that Mill, in his defense of individualism, goes a long way in providing a very strong argument in favor of human dignity and, why individual autonomy is sacred and important and a component of human flourishing, notwithstanding some of the dangers.
I think Mill makes the very best case for individualism and what we now call political liberalism. Not saying it's totally persuasive, but I think if you're going to read any of them, this is the guy.
And of course, the criticism is that he doesn't factor in enough the importance of tradition in the formation of character, the importance of the community, that this individualism descends into what Tocqueville warned about, the solipsism of, the individual confined to the solitude of his own heart.
Yeah.
Mill also warns against nanny state. His argument very much parallels Tocqueville's, that the expansion of the state will rob individuals of their agency, will make them dependent, will stultify their development, and really lead to a society, a culture of mediocrity and conformity.
Even if one doesn't agree with the rest of Mill, I think this is something everyone could agree with, which is government doesn't do a lot of things well. Government, as it grows and becomes more distant, more centralized, does even fewer things well. And when that power is consolidated and you don't see more even traditional principles like subsidiarity in
Right.
place, then originality gets stamped out, and you do have a tyranny, not just of the majority, but a tyranny of mediocrity, which is why maybe the most audacious claim in the essay, as I encountered it, was he says, when there are conflicting opinions, one being the popular view, let's say that God exists, and the atheist view, which at this time would have still been considered quite radical. You should protect both views, but you should especially protect the atheist view, the heretical view, the unpopular view. That's the one that's going to need the most protection, which is kind of funny today because it's flipped. And now the state view is kind of like the atheist secular view. But one sees why. I mean, anyone who's ever had the experience of talking to a government bureaucrat or just living in a society with lots of other people knows that.
If you're a small business owner in New York.
Yeah. Good luck. Are there any left? I didn't even know there were any left. Yeah.
There's some. My state.
Well, you could come here if you want to experience. If you want to experience a life on liberty, you can come to Tennessee.
It's hard to buy cigars there with the excise tax.
I'll tell you, when it comes to cigars, I go further on liberty than John Stuart Mill does. Actually, I am as hardcore as it gets. Joe, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much. Cigars and freedom.
Maybe after this. You will not be joining us for cigars, but thank you for joining us for the book club. We will see you next time. Thank you so much for watching this episode of the Book Club on PragerU. PragerU is a 501c3 nonprofit organization, so we rely on donations from viewers like you to keep this content on the air. Please consider making a tax-deductible contribution today to help keep this content coming. Thank you very much.